All right, it is noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending the first edition in our summer historical briefing series, the Osprey Point Gardens of Bertha Honore Palmer. Um, my name's Amanda Pasek, and I am the Associate Director for Digital Marketing at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. And I will be fielding questions. We'll have an opportunity for questions in the middle of the presentation and then again at the end. And without further ado, here is our VP for Regional History, John McCarthy.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our President and CEO, Jennifer Romanicki. No sooner had we completed our anniversary briefing series that Jennifer asked me if I'd like to do a summer series. And so, of course, I would like to do a summer series. So we have 3 programs planned for you this summer, and we're going to kick it off with a program about Bertha Palmer's gardens at our historic Spanish Point campus. For the anniversary series, of course, we focused on the downtown campus and the Selby legacy and all of the great things that the organization has done during its 50-year history. So I thought I'd turn my attention south today and explore the gardens at historic Spanish Point. This program really was conceived as soon as the Spanish Point campus was adopted by Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. One of our longtime and hardworking volunteers, Peg Kapustiak, approached me and said, John, if we're going to be part of a botanical garden, we need to be thinking about these gardens a little bit more. And Peg suggested to me that what we had at the campus was one of the first Edwardian gardens created in the United States. And so Peg and I both did more research on this, and I became fascinated by it. And so for the last 4 years, I've been trying to do a little bit more research here and there. And I have presented on this topic before, but this program is changed up a little bit. And hopefully it'll help you really have a greater appreciation for what appears to be a random set of gardens at Spanish Point campus, but is actually all part of a big plan. So we're going to share the program today in 3 sections. One called Osprey Point, because I'm using that term maybe for the first time for a lot of you. And that is the name that Bertha Palmer gave to all the property that she had there adjacent to what we now call the historic Spanish Point campus. It stretched from the Vamo community all the way down to Osprey, and it extended on both sides of US 41. But for the most part, the term Osprey Point was used to describe the property that she owned there between Vamo and Osprey and west of US 41, where the Oaks Bayside subdivision is today and where the historic Spanish Point campus is today. Our next section will be on what inspired Bertha to create these gardens in the way she did. And then we're going to actually take a look at historical photographs of the gardens and talk about what's there today. So Amanda's keeping an eye on the questions, as she said, and you can put your questions in the chat. And then midway and at the end, we'll try to answer all those questions. So starting with Osprey Point. Well, this is where Bertha Palmer lived on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, and it would be a big change from her stone castle, where the last party that she hosted, she invited 4,000 guests, to her purchasing this property down in this little town of Osprey, south of this little town of Sarasota. And she began investing in this real estate in 1910, and by 1911 was well underway of acquiring tens of thousands of acres of land in what we now call Sarasota County. But this is one of the earliest photographs that we have of Bertha Honore Palmer outside of the little hunting lodge that she acquired. And this would be located directly north of the north boundary of the historic Spanish Point campus. This little building was located in what today would be part of the Oaks Bayside subdivision, directly east of the Palmer Boat Dock, which still exists there on that property today. And you can see a rather small building here, but it's a little fancy. It has some nice round columns out on the porch, has these nice dormer windows up there in the roof looking out toward the bay, and beautiful oak trees, which is what inspired her to call the residence the Oaks. Now, today, the whole subdivision is called the Oaks, but back then it was just the home itself. And with her in this particular photograph is Adrian C. Honore, her brother, who was very much involved in all of her real estate dealings here in Sarasota and her development activities in Fruitville and Bee Ridge and Venice, where she was busy developing and promoting this area to people all over the world. But this is the way the place looked when she first acquired it. This is land that was originally owned by the homesteading Webb family, and then they gave a part of this land to their daughter Lizzie. She sold a part of the land to Lawrence Jones, who built this house, and they used the money from that purchase to build the Gupto house that's on our campus today. So this is an aerial photograph showing most of the Osprey Point estate. And I'll use my cursor to kind of get you oriented. Here's the point of Spanish Point down kind of on the bottom part of the image. So that's projecting out into Little Sarasota Bay. Here is the area of the Gupto house, kind of toward the middle of the image. And then here is the Palmer boat dock on the shore of Little Sarasota Bay. And then the Oaks home is right here. Very difficult to see because of all the oak trees. And it had become a sprawling mansion. She had added to it many rooms. The little lodge was kind of lost inside the building that she ended up creating here. And then we begin to see some of the gardens themselves. And so I think I have another image where we label all of these. So if you look here, here's the Oaks residence. So that was kind of the starting point for the gardens, which extended out in two different directions. The garden closest to her home really was the sunken garden. And this was simply an area of low land along the shoreline that she did not fill and raise it up in elevation. Instead, she raised up some areas adjacent to it, put in some little steps there, and had this little sunken garden, which was filled with oak trees and palms. And we'll see some images of that later. And then directly north of there, she had Mirror Lake, which was a large reflection pool. And at the end of that reflection pool, she had a pergola so that she could entertain her guests there in the shade and have a nice little outdoor room, which then would look down through the reflection pool to the mansion itself. Now, this little gazebo up here later in the program, when you see an image of that, you'll recognize it because years ago, that design was duplicated in what we now use as the Welcome Center there at Historic Spanish Point campus. And then south of the residence, south of the Oaks, was Blue Garden. And Blue Garden was tied up against the house and then extended to the south. And Blue Garden was a French-inspired garden. She used it to grow white and blue flowers. And this one was very close to her house, and so she could enjoy it every day, look out the window and admire her garden. Bertha Palmer is, of course, famous for her work in Chicago, but she was actually a native of the Bluegrass State. And her heritage was French, and so a lot of things kind of point to blue being her favorite color. And so the Blue Garden is that French element in her overall garden plan. We actually have a very small portion of the Blue Garden that exists at the historic Spanish Point campus. And that's if you make it all the way up to the end of the Jungle Walk where the little shell cascade is. The shell cascade was the southernmost feature in the Blue Garden and the northernmost feature of the Jungle Walk. And so you can see concrete curbing there when you come to visit. And that's the concrete curbing that was installed in 1912 to create the Blue Garden. Now, the Blue Garden doesn't exist anymore. And so I've labeled some of these items that are off of our campus with green, and then the ones that are on the historic Spanish Point campus in yellow. And this red line kind of shows the property boundary. Now, remember, originally Bertha Palmer had all of this, and this was all considered her Osprey Point estate. So moving south from Jungle Walk, we have a naturalistic trail. Moving south from Blue Garden, we have a naturalistic trail called Jungle Walk, which was designed as a garden pathway filled with lush tropical vegetation that she had brought in from all over the world. And a lot of the materials that she planted are still there today. And then also her famous aqueduct, which begins behind the Gupta house runs along the edge of the Indian mound and then crosses the low area that exists leading up to the Shell Cascade. So the aqueduct, which we'll see some images of later, was inspired by her travels to Europe, as you will find all of her garden designs was originating from her travels in Europe. And then we have Fern Walk, which is the garden behind the Guptill house. And the Fern Walk is a very low area in the center of the archaic shell ring. So that's a 5,000-year-old shell mound with a very low center to it. And that's where she had her Fern Walk garden. And then she actually had a walk path called the Orchid Walk, which cut diagonally from the Guptill house down toward Duchesne Lawn. So we don't have a trail in that location today, but you can actually see it on this photograph coming down thusly and then intersecting the trail down to Duchesne Lawn. And then, of course, most people that have been to Spanish Point, they've seen Duchesne Lawn with the classic portal. Again, 1912 construction, carefully restored. Duchesne Lawn that you see today at historic Spanish Point is just a small portion of the original Duchesne Lawn, which had a east-west component and a north-south component. The vast majority of it was actually east of our property boundary and is now occupied by single-family residences that are part of the Oaks Bayside subdivision. The Duchesne Lawn originally was the original homesteading Webb family's garden. And so Bertha Palmer didn't have to clear it. It had already been cleared. It was very flat. What she did was plant palm trees in two, perpendicular colonnades. And then another garden that she planted very early on was her rose garden. And you notice, curiously, it's nowhere near her house. You would think she would have put the rose garden very close to her home so she could enjoy that on a daily basis and, have cut roses in the home. But instead, she placed it out here to the east because this is where she was going to build her future Italian villa, a much larger home, even than the one that she had expanded there on the bayfront that she called the Oaks. And so there's a part of Duchesne Lawn that's off of our property that really doesn't exist anymore. And then there's a part of Duchesne Lawn that's a part of the campus. And of course, Duchesne Lawn isn't filled with flowers or flowering shrubs. It is designed as a lawn of cleanly shorn grass, which was a very, very fancy thing to do back in this era, to have a lawn of grass. And then perhaps her most famous garden here on the campus and at her Osprey Point estate, the sunken garden and pergola, which you see out on the point itself. And that's where she entertained guests with tea, and she had views of the bay in both directions. And this was essentially a room in nature. It was an extension of the living room of her home. And it was all the way down here on the south side of her property. And then east of there, the ornamental pond, which is behind the Welcome Center, and which you might pay more attention to after seeing this program today, because that was another garden feature. Okay, so this is, if it was hard for you to see the aerial photograph, we put together, this little sketch was put together years ago. There's a match line here. So you see Mirror Lake at the north end. I've got my cursor over here on the left. The sunken garden that was in front of the Oaks house. The Oaks house here as number 3, and the Blue Garden as number 4, and then coming back up here to the Blue Garden. You see both the Jungle Walk Trail, which is in yellow here, the aqueduct, which is in blue that I'm trying to follow with my cursor. And then you come down via the Orchid Walk. Again, Orchid Walk, or number 7, does not exist anymore, but that came over here. And then you went down here to Duchesne Lawn, where you can see in some light green that Duchesne Lawn, again, was this kind of crisscross pattern of palm planted in rows, California Washingtonian palms and some queen palms. And then the rose garden over here, sunken garden and pergola, and then the ornamental pond. There's also a small garden out at the end of the point. And for some years, there's been some discussion as that being one of Bertha Palmer's gardens, But our research has borne out that more than likely this was owned by Walter Conrad, who actually owned this property. Bertha Palmer tried to buy the property from him, and he ultimately sold it to her, but only with a life estate. And he lived longer than she did. So she really never had an opportunity to create gardens on it. But he was an orchid collector and a butterfly collector, and he had his own gardens out there, which you can kind of see the ruins of if you go out to Spanish Point. But it's beyond the scope of our presentation today because we now believe that that was not one of Bertha Palmer's gardens. Now, one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that in creating her gardens on this piece of property, maybe it wasn't her deliberate intent, but she ended up saving and preserving and protecting the Native American shell mounds that are such a prominent part of the property. And she saw them as a way to, to decorate them, if you will, to garden them, to plant more flowers and plant more, plant bamboo and plant more palm trees and all these things. But in doing so, she saved them at a critical time when most shell mounds in this area were unfortunately being mined for hard material to pave roads with. Sarasota had its first automobile in 1909. By 1910 and 11, lots of people had cars, and everybody was concerned about making the sandy roads easier to drive on. And so this is just one of numerous images that you can find online of Florida's Native American heritage being converted into roadways. Here's another shot. This is a mound that was up near Whitaker Bayou. And cutting through this mound allowed oyster shell material and other shell material that was used to pave part of what we now call the Tamiami Trail up there. So those mounds are completely gone now. Now, I do want to, before we move on to more about the gardens, I want to talk a little bit more about the name Osprey Point, because my gosh, we've got historic Spanish Point, we've got Oaks Bayside residential subdivision. Now I'm talking about Bertha Palmer's gardens at Osprey Point. What does it all mean? Well, going back in time, the Webb family, the original homesteaders on their trip from New York to the Manatee River area, encountered a Spanish fisherman who told them about a prominent landmark of a site that extended out into Sarasota Bay and a place that he thought would be a great place for them to start a homestead. And so in 1867, when they found the property and they arrived at the site, they wrote a letter back to their friends in New York saying, "We have arrived at the Spanish Point." And that's where that name comes from the likely a gentleman from Cuba, one of the fishermen that had fished the west coast of Florida for years, who had told him about the place, and that's where the name Spanish Point comes from. Most people in the area called the property Webb's Point. And in fact, even the Webbs, the homesteaders, didn't call it Spanish Point all the time. John Webb called it Little Sarasota. And he saw a community being established there, and reflecting Sarasota being kind of the big town, downtown. He wanted to call it Little Sarasota, but when he applied for a post office, the U.S. Postal Service said that name sounds too much like Sarasota. It'll confuse people, and so therefore you need to come up with a different name. Now, just so you know, Little Sarasota is almost a play on words, because on the one hand, it takes its name from the fact that the property is adjacent to Little Sarasota Bay. The island offshore is Little Sarasota Key, which we now call Siesta Key. The connection to the Gulf of Mexico was called Little Sarasota Pass, and that's now Turtle Beach Lagoon and Heron Lagoon. But at any rate, everything around him was Little Sarasota, and that's why he wanted to be Little Sarasota. But when they wouldn't let that community be called Little Sarasota, he called it Osprey for the fish hawk that we see almost every day when we're on the campus, and that occurred in 1884. When Bertha came along and started purchasing property in 1911 and building her gardens in 1912, she called the whole place Osprey Point. So she took the name of the town, not an incorporated town, but the village, if you will, and then she recognized the aspect of the point and utilized that. And then she called her house the Oaks. And we'll talk a little bit later about how that changed. Well, we're going to talk about it right now. After World War II, her grandson, Gordon Palmer, came to the property and started restoring the gardens. He established the Palmer Nurseries, and he opened the gardens up for a tourist attraction. And here's the big billboard that was on 41, right on the property. US 41, or the Tamiami Trail, was only 2 lanes wide. You can see an old car from the 50s driving by. And they started offering guided tours of the house and the gardens. But you'll notice that the name here is the Oaks. the historic Potter Palmer estate. So in this case, Gordon Palmer has applied the name the Oaks to the whole property, very different than it was when Bertha was there. So this is why most people just think of the whole thing as the Oaks. There's the Oaks subdivision and then historic Spanish Point campus. This is a little brochure that Gordon Palmer produced to attract people to come down to the site. Of course, it's pretty far distant, 10 miles away from downtown Sarasota. So you've got to encourage people to go down there. And then these are some of the things that they teased you with. A beautiful image in the upper left of the aqueduct and the little stairs that go down toward the Shell Cascade. A beautiful image next in line of Blue Garden, and then Mirror Lake, and then an interior, one of the fireplaces in the home. Below that, one of the wheat stacks paintings from Claude Monet, because the home was still filled with all the Impressionist art. And then down on the far left in the middle, her boat dock. And then below that, kind of some sketches of some of the archaeological materials, because at the same time, Ripley and Adelaide Bullen, archaeologists associated with University of Florida, were doing work there on the campus. And then there's an image of Jungle Walk. And then there's kind of some promotion for the nursery there. You could come to visit the gardens, get inspired by all the plants, and then go purchase those plants at the nursery before you went back home. So let's talk a little bit about Bertha's inspiration. Seems like these are just a bunch of little gardens and pathways and stuff like that. What was really going on? Well, Bertha was highly educated, played several musical instruments, spoke 5 languages, was a world traveler, had become involved in the Columbian Exposition, which was the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. This would really be the first World's Fair to feature the accomplishments of women. And Bertha Palmer traveled throughout Europe, encouraging various organizations and government entities to send their women, send their accomplishments of women. And within the Columbian Exposition grounds was actually a women's building. This was also the first time that a separate building for women's accomplishments has been built as part of a World's Fair. Now, most people know that Bertha Honore Palmer was the chairman of the board of lady managers of the women's building, that she helped hire Sophia Hayden, the architect, to design it. She hired other people to do murals inside of it and to do a commemorative coin and that sort of thing. But she also, this is where she encountered Frederick Law Olmsted, who was involved in helping to plan the layout of the whole fair. And I think she learned a couple of things from this. Number one, she learned that you can transform land. Now, her husband had done this in a huge way at Lakeshore Drive, converting a marsh into the Lakeshore Drive residential area through dredge and fill material. But one of these World's Fairs is like, you build this whole thing in a couple of years, and it's a huge transformation on the landscape. And I think what she learned from this is that you can do that. You can transform a landscape very quickly if you have a plan and you have a workforce, and of course you have the resources to bring to bear. And so I think that she became more interested in landscape design in her travels to Europe. And I'll touch upon why I say that in a moment. She met Claude Monet. She went to visit him in Giverny after having visited the Barbizon School of Artists up in the forests. And then she ultimately made her way to Giverny and met Claude Monet and bought a number of paintings from him, and may have been inspired even by what he had done, because he had tremendously converted the property there by damming off a little part of the river that went through and creating all the lily gardens, the aquatic gardens, and the little famous Japanese bridge and such. And so this, I think, was part of Bertha's inspiration as well. And then in 1900, she was appointed by President McKinley as one of the very first diplomats to represent the United States in the foreign land. I should say one of the first female diplomats, which Congress was very opposed to. And the president overrode Congress and appointed her anyway. And she became an ambassador for the purpose of representing the United States at the Paris Expo in 1900. So again, she's back to Europe. By this point, she's got the home in Chicago, a home in Rhode Island, an apartment in London, an apartment in Paris. And of course, within a few years, she's purchased her property in the Sarasota area. One of her friends that she liked to spend time with in Europe was King Edward VII. This is the son of Queen Elizabeth. And King Edward VII was interested in doing things a little differently than his mother had done. And in one of the areas where he was doing things differently was in terms of gardening. During the Victorian era, gardens were very, very formal. A lot of straight lines, a lot of squares, and everything kind of in its place, well manicured, completely altered, not so naturalistic, more horticultural. And so he was trying to break out of that. He wanted things to be more naturalistic. He wanted to replicate nature and create a different type of garden. And I think that the time that he spent with Bertha Palmer, whether that was in London or in Paris, because we do know that they spent time together in Paris, that I think this is the principal inspiration for how she did her gardens and what has now been called the Edwardian garden for King Edward. And an example of that would be this little postcard view from years later, showing just an effusive overgrowth of colorful plants, a little stone pathway that looks very rustic, a little archway made out of twigs and then vines growing upon it. But you'll notice that the flowers are overlapping the edges and they're not symmetrical, and you don't see any straight lines. And ironically, this is what would later be called the Old English garden. But in the era of the early 1900s, this was a whole new way for wealthy people to interpret gardens and to create gardens. One of the examples that he really thought was important was to bring water into the garden. And these are two examples of, little reflection ponds, also, little staircases, little structures, making the garden a place not just to look at, but a place to live in and to enjoy and appreciate, to take some time and reflect and to be a part of nature. And you'll notice even here, the stones are not all the same. They're like random stones all put together, and they're very naturalistic feel to all of this. And also you look out and you see another set of, like on the left here, you see another set of stairs going up to another terrace. And then you see a higher elevation back beyond that. So these are all elements of what would be the new Edwardian garden philosophy. And again, by the 1930s, here's a postcard from the 1930s calling it the Old English Garden. And yet this was actually very new. In this particular image, you see some little arbors here made out of, branches. And again, you just see a profusion of plants. Another good example, a nice little, probably crushed stone walkway, and just no symmetry to it, no focus on particularly straight lines. And so there were some aspects to this, though. Here are some other influences. Here's a book by Edith Wharton, who was really showing people how they could replicate Italian villa gardens. And of course, Bertha Palmer had spent a lot of time in Italy. That certainly inspired the type of columns that she used at her Osprey Point estate, which are all Tuscan border columns. And then also it inspired, the whole sunken garden effect there. And then on the right-hand side of this image is a catalog for pots, ceramic vessels as flower pots, decorative flower pots for your garden. And this was put out by the landscape architect Duchesne, who was a Parisian landscape architect who she had consulted with and then ultimately named her lawn for him. So Duchesne Lawn takes this name. This was a father and son landscape architecture firm. The father, I believe, had passed away by the time Bertha Palmer got involved. So she was working with the son. So there were a number of books, and she collected a number of books on gardening. The image in the middle is simply a Maxfield Parrish print. You'll notice the booklet on the left is illustrated by Maxfield Parrish. If you're not familiar with this artist, he created a number of scenes like on a pergola. So you see this one, and those columns are also Tuscan order. And so that kind of reminds me of the Spanish Point sunken garden and pergola. So to kind of talk about some of the aspects or elements of Edwardian garden, this is clearly where architecture meets landscape architecture. Again, I mentioned, things like pergolas, arches, small structures, and areas to encase water. And then part of the idea was to capture the rural romance, the romance of the countryside, and do so perhaps in a more urban setting. Now, Bertha Palmer wasn't doing it in an urban setting. She was doing it in a country estate setting. But all the same, it was to capture this romance of nature and the great outdoors. And then the utilization of on-site materials, whether that's native stone, which there are a number of examples of at Spanish Point with some bog iron, stone, and also shell material, and then native timbers and that sort of thing. And part of the idea was to evoke this distant past, to try to make your garden look like it had been there for hundreds of years, that it was an ancient place that you could explore, even to the extent of some of it looking perhaps like ruins, of an ancient civilization. So this brought in your elements like your vases, your columns, and sculptures. And this was a way to kind of show off some of your souvenirs from your world travels. You would go to these foreign places and you would find objects, and Bertha Palmer would fall in love with them, and she would purchase them and have them shipped back to Sarasota and then to Osprey to go into her gardens. The exuberant, colorful plantings was a huge part of the Edwardian garden to really break away from the construct of the Edwardian era, of the Victorian era, and enter a new time of a little bit more freedom and a little more naturalistic. And then also gardens that could be viewed from the window of your mansion, almost like they were a framed work of art. So that's kind of interesting. And then gardens like rooms in nature. And I think the best example of that, a couple of good examples of that at Spanish Point would be the Mirror Lake reflection pool, which is not on our campus, but which a reduced size version of it still exists in the Oaks Bayside subdivision, because this reflection pool did not have a view of the bay. It was surrounded by the oak, cedar, and palm hammock that dominated that landscape naturally. And so that reflection pool was like a room in nature. The sunken garden pergola, similarly, was like a room in nature. And you didn't see everything there because of all the vegetation. Right now, it's all open, but you didn't see everything. You kind of walked down the little steps and the room unfolded. So these are all the things. And so we're going to take a moment and see if we have any questions from our audience at this point, and then we're going to actually explore the gardens themselves.
All right, thank you, John. So we have a question. I was told that Lawrence Jones' home was 4 rooms, but it looks larger. Do you know how large it was?
Well, I don't, there probably were 4 rooms downstairs and a couple of rooms upstairs, and I don't know how many rooms were in that house, but the original house, she only had it in its original form for a couple of months, and then she started expanding. So we're going to look at some photographs in the next part of the program that'll show you the expanded house. So it went from being maybe 4 rooms with a couple of rooms upstairs to being quite the rambling mansion.
Great. What happened to the Oaks Mansion?
What happened to the Oaks Mansion? So the Oaks Mansion, after Gordon Palmer passed away in the early 1960s, the Oaks Mansion started to become vandalized, and kids from the neighborhood were playing there. The family became concerned about safety, and there was a lot of deferred maintenance. The building was actually burned as a fire department training exercise, and then the rest of it was hauled to the landfill. And many of the items around it, like the vessels, the clay pots, and things like that, were actually saved. So they didn't really scrape the whole landscape, but they did take out the house. And so that, I think, disappeared by the mid 1960s. It was gone.
Great. And then what role did Bertha Palmer have in garden design?
Oh, well, she is quoted several times in the contemporary media that she designed the gardens. She had help. She tried to get Olmsted to help her, and he never had time. She kept reaching out to Reasoner Brothers Nursery in Oneko for some help with different things, and they didn't have time for her. They sold her a lot of plants, but they didn't have time really to help. And she was obviously inspired by Duchesne's work. But she claims that she designed the gardens herself, and specifically the sunken garden and pergola. She was very proud of. She said that was her favorite garden, although the blue garden was also her favorite garden. She said she designed them herself. So she had a lot of ideas. You know, she'd been all over the world, and she knew what she wanted. So I think she sketched it out and she made it happen.
Great. And then one more. What was, was the Cox Bridge installed by Mrs. Palmer?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. No, that was actually installed by Mr. Cox as a way to get out to visit his friend, Mr. Conrad, at the end of the point, because all the trails that are there today didn't exist back then. But she did have a boardwalk, and it ran from Duchesne Lawn down toward White Cottage. And actually, I'm going to point that out in one of the last slides we're going to see. So I'll try to remember to point that out. The only thing left of that are the little stubs of the piling are still out there in the mangroves. It is amazing. That was put in 1912, and they're still there today.
All right, thank you. No more questions.
All right, let's move back to the program. So now let's talk about the gardens as you see them down at the historic Spanish Point campus today. So here again, this is the old fishing camping lodge. And this is actually after she's been there a little while. You see the gentleman on the left, he's watering the lawn, but look how fast this transforms. Now this is Bertha Palmer. Now she's got a crushed shell trail. She has concrete curbs on a pathway going from the house. Let's go back. See, that doesn't exist back in this era. There's no pathways. It's just the house sitting in the woods. And she's actually planted cast iron plant along both sides of the walkway, you can see. And then she's got some other things growing up by the house. She was totally infatuated by the palm trees, the cabbage palms, and the live oaks. And you see all the Spanish moss there hanging from the live oaks. Now, this is the expanded house. So this is within a year or so from the little Lawrence Jones Lodge. She's got this magnificent house that goes out in all directions, raised the roof on it. You see much larger dormer windows, put in the arch top double French doors there, and replicated the columns and extended them all along a much wider veranda looking out toward the bay. You still see the concrete curbs, the crushed shell trail, the cast iron plant going along the side, but now you see some of these urns that she purchased out of the Duchesne catalog. And so you see urns along the front porch there, and we'll see those time and time again in these photographs. So this is just a little sketch of that area here, Mirror Lake, the Oaks. You can see that Mirror Lake and the Oaks are connected by a very straight pathway. This again was crushed shell with concrete curbs. And then you see the gazebo north of there. You see the sunken garden down here. And so what I might not have shared with you is north of the gazebo was a set of tennis courts. And they also were completely enclosed in the woods. So you didn't have a lot of wind when you were out there playing tennis. And so these are the gardens that were directly adjacent to her home there, the Oaks. So here's Mirror Lake. And again, you see the gazebo at the northern end. Next time you come to historic Spanish Point, you go up to the Welcome Center, you'll see this, the replica done very nicely. Beyond the gazebo were the tennis courts. You see a column in the foreground, again, a Tuscan column. That was the style she used for all of them. You see a big urn over in front of the gazebo, and there are some other things there as well. This is another image, and this one shows some ornamental pillars, if you will, up there by the gazebo. And then also you can kind of see the effusive growth that's allowed to go over the edge of the trail. And in this particular case, this photograph, I believe, represents some years when it had not been exceptionally well cared for, but it wouldn't have been that much different when she was there. This is a little work of art by Robert Chase, a local Sarasota artist. who did a series of paintings of the Oaks property, which appeared in Ford Times magazine. And this, through a total coincidence, within about a week of the adoption of the historic Spanish Point campus by Selby Gardens, I found this little Ford Times magazine on eBay with an article about the Oaks. And so I purchased it and so have these images. But here again, you see the gazebo set up with table and chairs. You see the urns outside and the beautiful reflection pool with the large lilies growing in them. And so this is kind of the way it was in the 1950s when it was open to the public. This particular article in Ford Times magazine was to encourage you to travel, when you travel to Sarasota, when you travel to Florida, to come and see the Oaks estate that's at that point open to the public. And then going back, we're going to work our way south from here. So we've started at the northernmost garden, which is the Mirror Lake. And then this is the Oaks home. You can see the tremendous expansion of it over time. Again, you see the crushed shell walkway down below, which leads to the Mirror Lake. You see the urns that she purchased through Duchesne. And you see some bamboo that has now grown in on the left-hand side. And then this is a photograph that was taken from the veranda looking out to the bay. It was done by Thomas Arnold, who was a photographer who then color tinted the photographs and turned them into postcards. So this is a postcard that was used to promote the area. And so it's labeled View of Mrs. Potter Palmer's Place near Sarasota, Florida. Again, you see the urns, you see the beautiful oak trees. And interestingly enough, a lot of these oak trees still exist on the Oaks Bayside property and are part of a common area that includes a smaller version Mirror Lake, as well as a number of these urns are still there. And so they have some of the Bertha Palmer gardens over on that side as well. This is just sweeping a little bit to the left or to the south. And again, you see the same urns. You see the nice tile veranda there. You see these sweeping live oak trees that just to Bertha Palmer were just the most romantic things in the world. And you actually see palm tree twisted up in the oak trees, these very slender sable palms or cabbage palms. And one of the historical narratives is that when she looked up and saw the palm tree entwined in the oak, she just fell in love with the place and decided this was going to be her Florida estate. Now, in the background of this image, try to show you here with my cursor, you actually see the point extending out into the bay as a backdrop for this particular view. And then this is another color postcard view showing the front of the house. This one's a couple of years later. So you can see how much everything has grown, and it's becoming quite the jungle here directly adjacent to her home. Now, as far as Edwardian gardens are concerned, even King Edward said it was still okay to have formal gardens close to your home, but the further you moved away from the home, the garden should become more naturalistic. And in any case, this garden was west of the home. This is the sunken garden that nobody knows about because it exists only within Oaks Bayside subdivision. But actually, in the last couple of years, they've excavated part of this to reveal the set of stairs that you see here. And this was just Bertha Palmer's way of kind of bringing some depth, some vertical changes to the landscape. She didn't dig this out. She just left this as the natural slope. And then she built the little concrete wall and then filled around it. And you see these huge Canary Island date palms. That's these palms here, these Canary Island date palms. And she would buy those by the railroad car load. And they would come 3 per railroad car. And so as you walk around the historic Spanish Point campus next time, count all the Canary Island date palms and try to figure out how many railroad cars of date palms she purchased. And then we'll have to add in the ones that she had up in this area. And then I think this is just kind of a neat view because it's right outside of the front door there of her home on the veranda, looking straight up toward Mirror Lake. So again, formal, straight lines near the house, but the further we move away from the house, the less formal it becomes. This is another one of the Robert Chase watercolors, again, of the front of the building. And you see the huge philodendron growing up into the oak tree, and you see the palm and the oaks intertwined in such a romantic way. And this is an interesting photograph because these are all guests of Bertha Palmer. And in the dark outfit here and the nice hat with the ribbon on it, that's actually Bertha. And so she's going to lead us over toward the Blue Garden, just south of the house. So this is the southern end of the Oaks house. And you see this is all open, screen, sleeping porch up here. This is also screen porch down here. And so to put that in perspective, the house is in purple here in the center. And then here's Blue Garden directly adjacent. And of course, you see Mirror Lake up here. So this is entering Blue Garden. And Blue Garden had a round component to it. Again, this was a French-inspired garden and had the nice little archways and some seating benches there. Here's another view looking up toward the Oaks house. And you can see at this point, this is quite the rambling mansion. No longer that little 4-room hunting lodge. Again, you see the arch that we just saw from the other side. You also see the circular pathways within Blue Garden. And you see this sculpture called The Boy with the Fish. And it's mounted on a concrete column. And this actually is on the Spanish Point campus now. When the property was developed, as they prior to the property being developed, the Palmer family contributed things to the historic Spanish Point effort. But also during construction, if they found anything, they kind of kicked it over the fence. And so we ended up with a lot of cool stuff that otherwise would have been destroyed over on the north side. So the next time you come to Spanish Point, in a little nook just beyond the stairs that go down where you see the aqueduct arches, if you go off to the right-hand side, you see the Boy with a Fish on its original concrete pedestal. And so it's nice to have that as a former feature of Blue Garden. And then another feature of Blue Garden is this large urn. This is actually cast iron with a porcelain enamel coating, and it's blue and white. So again, blue and white went with the French motif. And this also got kicked over onto the other side of the fence, so to speak. And in the early days of developing what we now call the historic Spanish Point campus for the public, this was actually found in the woods, and it was repurposed in the Fern Garden. So you'll recognize it next time you go down behind the Guptill House in the Fern Walk Garden. You'll see this. It's now the centerpiece for that. And this is made of several pieces of cast iron, and again with the beautiful porcelain enamel finish. This was probably ancient when Bertha Palmer acquired it, and it is just more ancient now. This photograph was taken actually in the Gordon Palmer era, and so you can see that the arches are different and the benches are different. There were a set of photographs taken by USF students at the invitation of Gordon Palmer, and that kind of documents kind of the state of affairs there in the late 1940s. So it's nice to have those images. And this is an image taken from the Blue Garden looking toward Jungle Walk, where you walk up the stairs and then you walk through the low area there where you see the arched aqueduct and then ultimately up the Jungle Walk. And I should point out that this is the only photograph that we have that shows this little elevated water transport system. And so the well that provided water for the entire estate was located behind the Guptill House. And then the water was pumped to all the gardens, to White Cottage, to the Guptill House, and to the Oaks from that point. And they actually had a system up here where if they needed to, they could dump all the water as a fire suppression move and get it all down to the Oaks. So here is the Blue Garden, and then here's the Shell Cascade. Like I say, it's the southernmost feature of Blue Garden, the northernmost feature of the Jungle Walk. The blue line here is the aqueduct, which crisscrosses the Jungle Walk Trail, runs along the edge of the mound all the way over to the artesian well. And then here's the actual Jungle Walk Trail coming down from the Blue Garden and coming down to the Guptill House. This is Jungle Walk. Jungle Walk was simply a pathway atop the ancient Indian mound, just wide enough to let people walk through, but basically the native vegetation allowed to remain in place. and then a lot of other vegetation added, particularly down toward where the arches of the aqueduct are. But I think I tell people, if I'm ever given a tour, I say this was how she maintained her privacy, because she used the Gupta house as a guest house, but you had to walk the jungle walk to get from the guest house to her house. So probably nobody was going to come knocking on her door after dark. They were in their guest house and she was home and everybody was happy. There was tremendous amount of correspondence between her site superintendent and her when she was not on the property. The site superintendent was kind of responsible for providing a daily report of what the workers had done. This was primarily an African-American workforce, people who lived on the property. In addition to the gardens, there was also something called the home farm. I could do an entire program just about the home farm, but just in a nutshell, it was a demonstration farm on the property east of the Oaks house that was used to see how many different types of fruits and vegetables could be grown in this part of Florida. And as she welcomed her friends and others down from Chicago and other parts to consider buying real estate here, the home farm was a way to show people how they could make money, more than enough money to pay for the land and the taxes and everything else that went along with it. But this is one of the typical notes that the superintendent sent to her on a daily basis. You'll notice this is a Sunday. It's Sunday, February 18th of 1917. So this is about a year and 3 months before she passed away. And he says he has 2 teamsters hauling 5 tons of citrus fertilizer from the railroad. So this would have been for the home farm. So the railroad was, of course, out where the Legacy Trail is today, kind of East Osprey. And then she had a couple of gardeners cleaning out the glass house. And then she had a couple of them raking the jungle and the fern walks. So they literally would have been walking along the same trails that all of our guests walk on today. And it says specifically 2 hours. They spent 2 hours there. And then a couple of other guys watering trees near the stable. So that was, again, part of the home farm. But I think those notes are pretty cool. So here's a wonderful watercolor, again, by Bob Chase for Ford Times of the aqueduct. And this was very romantic. Bertha Palmer had seen these aqueducts in Europe. Aqueducts do 2 things. I mean, they do primary thing, they transport water, but they do it in 2 ways. One way they do it is by running along the edge of a hill, and a little bit of a downward slope carries that water just so. And another thing that aqueducts have to do is span low areas, and they do that with these arches. And so it's kind of cool to me that at the historic Spanish Point campus, we have both types of aqueducts. Instead of having a hill, she had the shell mound. So she ran that aqueduct along the shell mound back behind what she called Hill Cottage, what we call the Gupta house. She renamed it from being the Gupta's house to being her Hill Cottage. And then, of course, running all the way down and terminating at the Shell Cascade. This is the Shell Cascade as it looked back in the 1990s. And when it was restored, there had been some damage done to it over the years. But this is a classic example of Edwardian landscape architecture, introducing water to the garden, using native materials from the site. In this case, this whole thing is made out of bog iron, which is a type of rock that you find by digging down in some of these coastal areas. And then the shells from the Indian mound, in this case, mostly left-handed lightning whelks inserted into mortar that was holding all the bog iron together and creating these little pathways for the water to fill up the vessel and then drip out and fill up another vessel and drip out. Here are some older photographs of the aqueduct. We've done a lot of restoration here in the last couple of years, so it looks much nicer today. But you can see that with your own eyes. You don't need me for that. This is the water tank that was just above actually just adjacent to the artesian well. And its place today is a huge steel pressure tank. These are 2 articles from 1912 that talk about the new water supply system. And it's a 400-foot deep well, 6 inches in diameter, artesian flow, which meant that it had its own head pressure. You didn't need a pump. You did need a pump to get it up into the Cypress water tank. And then the foundations for this water tank is still there today, and it kind of sitting on the same concrete platform where the big steel rusted pressure tank is now. And then this is a view of the Gupta house. And so she began to garden around the Gupta house, and she used red bricks to line the edge of the shell trails here. And we see that also in this particular postcard image. This is basically the downslope of the Guptill Mound going down toward where the boatyard is today. The boatyard existed prior to Bertha Palmer and it existed after her, but it did not exist when she was there. And you see some nice aloes and you see what looks like some red elephant ears and little pink flowers and a number of things growing here, as well as the oak trees, which are still there today. And then here's a view from the 1940s, again, taken by one of the USF students, looking down the slope of the Guptill House Mound out through the oak trees out toward Little Sarasota Bay. It's kind of hard to imagine, but where all of our mangroves are today was her driving path along the waterfront. And this extended all the way from her house down to where the boatyard is today, which was her turnaround. And so you see her concrete seawall, which was put in 1912, and you see the ruts of the auto drive. She liked to bring her guests from the house and just drive them along the bay, or if she brought them down to the guest house there at what we now call the Guptill House. But most of this concrete seawall completely failed, and then the shoreline eroded and mangroves have grown in their place. So this looks very different today. All right, so here we are at the Guptill House. Here we've got the water system back in here. We've got the orchid walk. So here's Gordon Palmer. He's the man really we can thank a lot for helping to save the site. I don't know what we would have done without Gordon Palmer, but again, he's the grandson, came down right after World War II when he got out of the service and kind of restored the property. I don't know exactly where this photograph was taken, but you see the wonderful arched oak tree with all the resurrection ferns and other epiphytes on it. This is approximately 1959 when the site was open for business. I threw this in because this is another one of the Robert Chase artworks from Ford Times of a wonderful Cattleya orchid growing along the jungle path here, probably on Orchid Walk. And then the Orchid Walk took you down to Duchesne Lawn. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a colonnade of palms going east-west and another one going north-south. And what we have today is this section on the left-hand side with the classic portal. And this is the classic portal actually looking, if you were standing near the bay, looking east. So people look at this today and they're very confused by it because they're not used to looking at the classic portal from the other side. But this is looking at the palm colonnade that now would be people's homes in the Oak subdivision. And then this is just another one of those notes. This one's March of 1917, and it says working up and cleaning out around the glass house, and then working and cleaning up Duchesne Lawn walks and that sort of thing. Oh, and here, raking up the oaks, lawn, jungle, etc., to the big engine. The big engine was the generator. At any rate, this is the reconstruction of the classic portal. The concrete is all original from 1912. And this scaffolding was put in place in the 1980s so that they could put a new wood top on it, which is what we have there today. Again, this photo is kind of abstract because it just shows the classic portal against woods. And later years, that was all cleared out. And now we see it as it is today, with the Duchesne Lawn having been restored. And actually, the California Washingtonian palms that flank both sides of this were planted in the original root ball holes for the original palms that were located by an archaeologist before we put those palm trees in. And then we're going to wrap up with Sunken Garden and Pergola all the way out on the point. I think most people are familiar with this. We've got the Bayside Cafe and the White Cottage here, and just beyond that, Sunken Garden and Pergola. Here it is under construction in 1912. Again, Tuscan order columns. This was specifically designed to support bougainvilleas, which is what she grew on it. This is a photograph that kind of shows you looking north how you had a much greater view because the mangroves had not grown up quite as high here, and you can look out over toward where the Guptill House is now and where her home was. The completed pergola. The garden itself, you see a little bit of the sunken garden here and the pool, surrounded by these little Italian cypress or some form of cypress that she planted all throughout the area. You see some nice benches there up on the pergola. Again, this is where she entertained with tea. And then here again, you see the pool. And look how dense the vegetation was between here and White Cottage. You can't even see White Cottage. Now, she also used White Cottage as a guest house. But in order to enjoy this garden, you had to walk down the same path you walk down today, and then you entered the end of it here on the right hand side via the steps, and it was literally a room in nature, and your views were north and south out to the bay, not east and west along the point. See, this is looking the other direction, and it's just all grown up. And so this was literally a room in nature. This is what it looked like the first time I saw it in December of 1979. Pergola had completely been obliterated by storms and decay. This is the reconstruction by Ball Construction, one of the first projects that was done on the site in the 1980s, completely rebuilt, the pool excavated and redone, and just before the sod went in. So these are great shots from the early years. Of course, this is what it looks like today. It's kind of the signature garden for the historic Spanish Point campus. It embodies everything about the Edwardian garden philosophy, the rooms in nature, the wonderful views, the incorporation of architecture, the bringing in elements from your travels, and that she was inspired by the Tuscan order columns and that sort of thing. And the final garden we'll talk about today is the ornamental pool, which again, we believe was inspired by her visits to Claude Monet's Giverny. And she dug this area out, used the material to fill around the sand burial mound and kind of flatten that area out. And again, inspired, we think, by her relationship with and her time she spent there in France. This is kind of what it looks like today with duckweed on the surface. But the horticultural volunteers have been doing an amazing job cleaning this area up. And this has the potential to be a nice showpiece in the future. And then just a few more slides before we wrap up with the final questions today. This is an urn that everyone sees who comes to the campus, and they wonder about it. And it is the Byzantine zodiac. And it's been there for a long time, at least since the, Bertha Palmer's time. And here it is at Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. And so it traveled from Lakeshore Drive, Chicago. Here it is again at Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, traveled down to Sarasota, and was an element that she brought from her place there down here, kind of tie it all together. And you can see the similarity. There's no doubt it's the same thing. The one on the left, the handle is actually facing us, so you don't quite see the handle. And on the one there at Spanish Point, you see the handle. And that's the same travel way that we use today at Spanish Point. So these are a couple of aerial photographs that were taken after a wildfire burned up the pine flatwoods of the home farm. And in this photograph, of course, you can see the point. And you can see Duchesne Lawn here, kind of in the middle where my cursor is. You can see all the palms on Duchesne Lawn. You can see the classic portal. And then Jungle Walk went through here. Gupto House is hidden back in here, but you also see Blue Garden here and Mirror Lake up here. So let's take a look at another photograph. Again, same time period, 1940s. You see the point, you see Sunken Garden and Pergola, you see Duchesne Lawn, and you see Blue Garden, you see Reflection Pool, Mirror Lake, and the tennis courts, the boat dock. This little point down here is, again, I mentioned that's where the auto turnaround was. And her boardwalk went from here over to here. And so this trail wasn't kind of used the way we use it today. You'd go straight from Duchesne Lawn or from the Gupto House and pick up the little footbridge that she had. The footbridge that we have now, which replicates the one from the 1890s, is here. But that was gone by the time she got the property, and she created one right at the edge of the oaks and the mangroves. Amazing. And so this is our last slide today. We'll wrap things up, but I hope that this helps you to enjoy your visits to the historic Spanish Point campus more and have a greater appreciation for the fact that it's not just some random stuff, but it was actually part of an overall plan to basically bring Europe to Florida and to bring nature back into as a guiding hand in developing the gardens, but also as a real romantic showplace where she hoped people would come, see what she had done, and want to do the same thing themselves, buy land from her, and really continue to develop Florida in this way. Now, Bertha Palmer first came to Sarasota in 1910. She did almost all of this garden construction in 1912, and she passed away on this property in May of 1918. So she accomplished a tremendous amount while she was here, not just on the gardens, but all throughout Sarasota, which is why we have such a significant Palmer legacy in the community. So once again, I'd like to thank Jennifer for inviting me to do a summer season of historical briefings. I'd like to thank Amanda so much for setting up the Zoom and for hosting today. And she probably has a few more questions for me. And thank all of you for joining us today. So I think I'll just pause on this particular slide and we'll see if we have any questions to wrap things up.
Yeah, we just have a few more questions. So
Okay.
before the mansion was burned, was artwork found in the mansion?
Well, everything was removed out of the mansion before it was burned. I mean, the burning was a deliberate exercise. And so the art, much of it is in the Art Institute of Chicago, also to family members. The furniture also went to a lot of family members. Much of the furniture was offered to Sarasota County, and Sarasota County Historical Resources has a huge collection of Bertha Palmer's furniture, sculpture, china, and other things like that that were donated by the family years ago. So there was nothing in terms of interior furnishings that were lost in the deal because it was a planned fire. They were going to bulldoze it anyway. They thought they let the fire department practice on it, and that's why it was burned. Some people say, John, it wasn't burned. It was bulldozed. I've seen a photograph. They're right. It was bulldozed after it was burned.
Right. Can you visit the areas in Bayside Oaks, or is it a gated community? We would like to see the Mirror Lake part.
Yeah, it's a gated community. We've had one opportunity where we took a group of master gardeners, some of which lived in the Oaks Bayside, and we had a real special day where we toured both sets of gardens. That would be a highly unusual thing to have the opportunity to do. But just knowing that those elements are there, I think should make us all feel good about the fact that a residential subdivision utilized, millions of dollars worth of real estate to retain the gardens that were part of the history of the site. And more and more, I find that the people who live in that area are becoming more interested in the history. So who knows what opportunities there might be in the future, but certainly they should come down and see our gardens because that really helps to round out the heritage of the neighborhood that they live in.
Great. Can you see Bertha's furnishings today?
There's no place that I can think of where you can see the furnishings. Again, you can see plenty of the art at Art Institute of Chicago. And the county occasionally puts certain items on exhibit. Furniture is a little bit of a challenge. You need a much bigger space. But yeah, I don't know of anywhere where you can actually see any of her furnishings.
Okay. And then one more question. Is this wonderful presentation available
Sure.
later online?
Well, Amanda, that's what I appreciate so much about you because we capture this on Zoom, you put it up on the YouTube channel, and then people can watch it to their heart's delight. And if anyone missed any of our 50th anniversary briefing series, those are also all up on YouTube. Just go to Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. And not only the historical briefings, but much virtual programming that our great staff and volunteers have helped to produce is all available there on the YouTube channel. And it's becoming one of my favorite channels.
All right. Thanks so much, John. We'll conclude there.
Well, thanks to everyone for joining us. And thank you, Amanda, for helping out. Super appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.